on out of there. Mom, come on, they set the house on fire. Now hide in the fields until they're gone. Come on, hurry. Quick.
Why?
Because I've held off those mobs as long as I'm able. From now on, I can't be responsible.
You mean you want us to leave everything we've fought all our lives for?
I mean, if you don't go and go quick, blood's going to run like water in the streets. Nothing I can do will stop it.
We're leaving here tonight.
Tonight?
We're crossing the river into Iowa.
The river's frozen over.
How else could we all cross it in one night? Heber, put some fellows on horses. Tell them to spread the word. Tell everybody to come just as they are. We've got to put the river between us and Nauvoo by morning, or there won't be enough of us left to worry about. You folks have been doing a lot of worrying and wanting to know what we're going to do next. Well, in the first place, we're going to start acting like we've got some common sense. We're going to build some strong new wagons, gather in all the food we can, get enough guns and ammunition, warm clothes, and whatever else we need, and then we're going to get out of here. Hallelujah.
I know it's not an easy thing I'm asking you to do. But we can do it, if we've got faith enough.
Hero born of woman, hero born of woman. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent with your heel. Crush the serpent with your heel, crush the serpent.
Welcome to Pioneers of American Socialism.
In the kingdom of heaven, the institution of marriage, which assigns the exclusive possession of one woman to one man, does not exist. In the kingdom of heaven, the intimate union of life and interest, which in the world is limited to pairs, extends through the whole body of believers, i.e., complex marriage takes the place of simple. Christ prayed that all believers might be one, even as He and the Father are one. His unity with the Father is defined in the words, "All mine are thine, and all thine are mine." This perfect community of interests, then, will be the condition of all when his prayer is answered. The universal unity of the members of Christ is described in the same terms that are used to describe marriage unity. The effects of the effusion of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost present a practical commentary on Christ's prayer for the unity of believers and a sample of the tendency of heavenly influences which fully confirm the foregoing proposition. All that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all, as every man had need. The multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul, neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. Here is unity like that of the Father and the Son, all mine thine, and all thine mine. Admitting that the community principle of the day of Pentecost and its actual operation at that time extended only to material goods, yet we affirm that there is no intrinsic difference between property in persons and property in things, and that the same spirit which abolished exclusiveness in regard to money would abolish, if circumstances allowed full scope to it, exclusiveness in regard to women and children. Paul expressly places property in women and property in goods in the same category, and speaks of them together, as ready to be abolished by the advent of the kingdom of heaven. The time, says he, is short, it remaineth that they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that buy as though they possessed not, for the fashion of this world passeth away. The abolishment of appropriation is involved in the very nature of a true relation to Christ in the gospel. This we prove thus: the possessive feeling which expresses itself by the possessive pronoun mine is the same in essence when it relates to persons, as when it relates to money or any other property. Amativeness and acquisitiveness are only different channels of one stream. They converge as we trace them to their source. Grammar will help us to ascertain their common center, for the possessive pronoun mine is derived from the personal pronoun I, and so the possessive feeling, whether amative or acquisitive, flows from the personal feeling, that is, it is a branch of egotism. Now egotism is abolished by the gospel relation to Christ. The grand mystery of the gospel is vital union with Christ, the merging of self in his life, the extinguishment of the pronoun I at the spiritual center. Thus Paul says, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. The grand distinction between the Christian and the unbeliever, between heaven and the world, is, that in one reigns the we spirit, and in the other the I spirit. From I comes mine, and from the I spirit comes exclusive appropriation of money, women, etc. From we comes ours, and from the we spirit comes universal community of interests. The abolishment of exclusiveness is involved in the love relation required between all believers by the express injunction of Christ and the apostles, and by the whole tenor of the New Testament. The new commandment is, that we love one another, and that, not by pairs, as in the world, but en masse. We are required to love one another fervently. The fashion of the world forbids a man and woman who are otherwise appropriated to love one another fervently. But if they obey Christ, they must do this, and whoever would allow them to do this, and yet would forbid them, on any other ground than that of present expediency, to express their unity, would strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, for unity of hearts is as much more important than any external expression of it, as a camel is larger than a gnat. The abolishment of social restrictions is involved in the anti-legality of the gospel. It is incompatible with the state of perfected freedom toward which Paul's gospel of grace without law leads, that man should be allowed and required to love in all directions, and yet be forbidden to express love except in one direction. In fact, Paul says, with direct reference to sexual intercourse, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any, thus placing the restrictions which were necessary in the transition period on the basis, not of law, but of expediency and the demands of spiritual freedom, and leaving it fairly to be inferred that in the final state, when hostile surroundings and powers of bondage cease, all restrictions also will cease. The abolishment of the marriage system is involved in Paul's doctrine of the end of ordinances. Marriage is one of the ordinances of the worldly sanctuary. This is proved by the fact that it has no place in the resurrection. Paul expressly limits it to life in the flesh. The assumption, therefore, that believers are dead to the world by the death of Christ, which authorized the abolishment of Jewish ordinances, legitimately makes an end of marriage. The law of marriage is the same in kind with the Jewish law concerning meats and drinks and holy days, of which Paul said that they were contrary to us, and were taken out of the way, being nailed to the cross. All experience testifies, the theory of the novels to the contrary notwithstanding, that sexual love is not naturally restricted to pairs. Second marriages are contrary to the one love theory, and yet are often the happiest marriages. Men and women find universally However, the fact may be concealed that their susceptibility to love is not burnt out by one honeymoon or satisfied by one lover. On the contrary, the secret history of the human heart will bear out the assertion that it is capable of loving any number of times and any number of persons, and that the more it loves, the more it can love. This is the law of nature, thrust out of sight and condemned by common consent, and yet secretly known to all. The law of marriage worketh wrath. 1. It provokes to secret adultery, actual or of the heart. 2. It ties together unmatched natures. 3. It sunders matched natures. 4. It gives to sexual appetite only a scanty and monotonous allowance, and so produces the natural vices of poverty, contraction of taste, and stinginess or jealousy. 5. It makes no provision for the sexual appetite at the very time when that appetite is the strongest. By the custom of the world, marriage, in the average of cases, takes place at about the age of 24, whereas puberty commences at the age of 14. For 10 years, therefore, and that in the very flush of life, the sexual appetite is starved. This law of society bears hardest on females, because they have less opportunity of choosing their time of marriage than men. This discrepancy between the marriage system and nature is one of the principal sources of the peculiar diseases of women, of prostitution, masturbation, and licentiousness in general.
No, the article in Ramparts was basically about socialism, right? And I don't believe in violent revolution. Yoko stated it very well, which is violent revolutionaries are playing the same establishment game. I believe in some of the things Jerry Rubin and A.B. Hoffman have done, like the theatre in court kind of revolution. I believe in the revolution of happening, and that artists, Yoko says artists don't create. Any woman can create, a man can destroy with a Coke bottle, and an artist revalues. If I'm a revolutionary, or we're revolutionaries, we're revolutionary artists, not gunmen. I believe in the Black Panther original statement, the 10-point program, which is not violent, which says to defend yourself against attack. I might consider that, but anything else I don't consider, so I'm still for peace, peaceful revolutionary. But I'm an artist first, and a politician second.
Hello, thank you for joining me on another edition of Pioneers of American Socialism. So, you heard there from John Humphrey Noyes. He talks about their complex marriage situation at the Oneida community. We're going to talk more about the Oneida community at the end of the show, but since it is Pride Month and we're celebrating the Stonewall riot and all that kind of thing, we're going to be looking at gender and sexual radicals of the 19th century. And a little bit of what we're going to be doing is maybe a little bit controversial, because I'm going to be including free love advocates, but also, we'll talk a little bit, not too much, but we'll talk about the Shakers as a group of gender and sexual radicals with their strict gender segregation and also celibacy. And we'll also talk about the Public Universal Friend, Jemima Wilkinson. That's who we'll sort of start with, talking about who was a prophet who was a genderless prophet. So Jemima Wilkinson, she was born as, but then at one point transformed into the Public Universal Friend, which was a genderless being. The followers of the Public Universal Friend referred to them as he, but the Universal Friend's detractors referred to them as she. So we'll get a little bit into the trickiness of pronouns, and actually somebody that was a reader on my thesis, the second reader on my thesis, was Paul Moyer at Brockport, who wrote the book on the Public Universal Friend. So we'll talk about a little bit about his use of pronouns there, and why, sort of applying our today sort of woke language is sort of ahistorical. So we'll talk about that, and then we're going to get into talking about the Mormons and the Mormon polygamy situation. Now, many people wouldn't consider Mormons pioneers of American socialism, but I do, because they had what was called the United Order, also known as the Order of Enoch, that was sort of modeled after the utopian idea of the city of Enoch. So the idea, though, was from each according to ability to each according to need. Again, another form of Christian socialism, like what we've been talking about a lot. And then finally, like I said, we'll conclude by talking about the Oneida community, and we'll talk a little bit more about their complex marriage arrangement. And we'll sort of conclude about some of the problems of extreme sexual radicalism. So before we get into all that, though, I want to start by talking about Frederick Engels, the founder, one of the founders of Marxism, one of the two main founders, of course, and his ideas on sex and relationships. He had a very interesting situation where his first wife, well, she was sort of a common law wife, but he never married her. And then after she died, he ended up actually marrying his sister. So I'm going to read here from an article from Smithsonian Magazine entitled "How Frederick Engels' Radical Lover Helped Him Father Socialism." Mary Burns exposed the capitalist son to the plight of the working people in Manchester by Mike Dash from August 1st, 2013. So he starts out, Frederick Engels' life appears replete with contradiction. He was a Prussian communist, a keen fox hunter who despised the landed gentry, and a mill owner whose greatest ambition was to lead the revolution of the working class. As a wealthy member of the bourgeoisie, he provided for nearly 40 years the financial support that kept his collaborator Karl Marx at work on world-changing books such as Das Kapital. Yet, at least one biographer has argued that while they were eager enough to take Engels' money, Marx and his aristocratic wife Jenny von Westphalen never really accepted him as their social equal. Amid these oddities lurks another, a puzzle whose solution offers fresh insights into the life and thinking of the midwife of Marxism. The mystery is this: why did Engels, sent in 1842 to work in the English industrial city of Manchester, choose to lead a double life, maintaining gentlemen's lodgings in one part of the city while renting a series of rooms in workers' districts? How did this well-groomed scion of privilege contrive to travel safely through Manchester's noisome slums, collecting information about their inhabitants' grim lives from the great work, The Condition of the Working Class in England? Strangest of all, why, when asked many years later about his favorite meal, would a native German like Engels answer Irish stew? To answer these questions, we need to see Engels not as he was towards the end of his long life, the heavily bearded grand old man of international. Further on down in the article, it says that Engels' relationship with Mary had a sexual element may be guessed from what might be a lewd phrase from Marx's, taking in the news that Engels had acquired an interest in physiology. The philosopher inquired, "Are you studying on Mary?" Engels did not believe in marriage, and his correspondence reveals a good number of affairs, but he and Burns remained a couple for almost 20 years. Nothing is known for certain about Mary's involvement in Engels' political life, but a good deal can be guessed. Census records and rate books from this period, and to the painstaking work of local historians, it is possible to trace the moments of Engels and the Burns sisters under a variety of pseudonyms. Engels passed himself off as Frederick Boardman, Frederick Mann Burns, and Frederick George Mann, and gave his occupation as bookkeeper or commercial traveler. There are gaps in the record and gaps in Engels' commitment to both Manchester and Mary. He was absent from England from 1844 until the very end of 1849, but Burns evidently retained her place in Engels' affections through the revolutionary years of 1848 and 49. Webb notes that after his return to Manchester, he and Mary seem to have proceeded more formally, setting up home together in a modest suburb. Lizzie moved in and seemed to have acted as a housekeeper, though details of the group's living arrangements are very hard to come by. Engels ordered that almost all of the personal letters he wrote during this period be destroyed after his death. Engels seems to have acknowledged Mary, at least to close acquaintances, as more than a friend or lover. Love to Mrs. Engels, the chartist Julian Harney wrote in 1846. Engels himself told Marx that only his need to maintain his position among his peers prevented him from being far more open. I lived nearly all the time with Mary so as to save money. Unfortunately, I cannot manage without lodgings. If I could, I would live with her all the time. Engels and Mary moved frequently. There were lodgings in Burlington and Cecil Streets where the Burns sisters appeared to have earned extra money by renting out spare rooms, and in 1862 the couple and Lizzie moved into a newly built property in Hyde Road, the street on which the Manchester martyrs would free Thomas Kelly and Timothy Deasy 5 years later. But the years, and perhaps Engels' long absences on business, private, and revolutionary, began to take their toll. In her 20s, Eleanor Marx recorded, "Mary had been pretty, witty, and charming, but in later years drank to excess." This may be no more than family lore. Eleanor was only 8 when Burns died, and she admitted in another letter that Mary I did not know, but it seems to fit the known facts well enough. When Burns died on January 6, 1863, she was only 40. If it is Mary Burns' death, not life, that scholars focus on, that is because it occasioned a momentous falling out between Engels and Marx, the only one recorded in 4 decades of close friendship. The earliest signs of discord date back several years. During a sojourn in Belgium between 1845 and 1848, during which the two men wrote the Communist Manifesto, Mary went to live in Brussels, an unusual adventure in those days for someone of her sex and class. Jenny Marx had few acquaintances among working-class women, and undoubtedly shocked Engels when Engels held up his lover as a model for the women of the future. Burns, Jenny thought, was very arrogant, and she observed sarcastically that I myself, when confronted with this abstract model, appear truly repulsive in my own eyes. When the two found themselves together at a workers' meeting, Simon Buttermilk reported, Marx indicated by a significant gesture and a smile that his wife would in no circumstances meet Engels' companion. It was against that backdrop that Engels wrote to Marx to tell his friend of Mary's death. "Last night she went to bed early," he wrote, and when at midnight Lizzie went upstairs, she had already died. Quite suddenly, heart disease or stroke. I received the news this morning. On Monday evening, she was still quite well. I can't tell you how I feel. The poor girl loved me with all her heart. Marx sympathized briefly. It is extraordinarily difficult for you, he wrote, who had a home with Mary, free and withdrawn from all human muck as often as you pleased. But the remainder of the missive was devoted to a long account of Marx's woes, ending with a plea for money. All my friends, Engels fired back in anger, including Philistine acquaintances, have shown me at this moment, which hit me deeply, more sympathy and friendship than I expected. You found this moment appropriate to display the superiority of your cool intellect. Marx wrote again apologizing, extending more elaborate condolences, and blaming his first letter on his wife's demands for money. What drove me particularly mad, he wrote, was that thought I did not report to you adequately our true situation. Mike Gain, among other writers, suspects that Marx objected to Engels' love of a working-class woman not on the grounds of class, but because the relationship was bourgeois and hence violated the principles of communism. Whatever the reason for the argument, Engels seems to have been glad when it ended. He lived with Mary's sister for more than 15 years. Whether their relationship was as passionate as the one Engels had enjoyed with Mary may be doubted, but he was certainly fond of Lizzie Burns. Just before she was struck down by some sort of tumor in 1878, he acceded to her dying wish and married her. She was of genuine Irish proletarian stock, he wrote, and her passionate and innate feelings of her class were of far greater value to me and stood me in better stead at moments of crisis than all the refinement and culture of your educated and ascetic young ladies. Historians remain divided on the importance of Engels' relations with the Burns sisters. Several biographers have seen Mary and Lizzie as little more than sexual partners who also kept house, something that a Victorian gentleman could scarcely have expected to do for himself. Terrell Carver has suggested that in love, Engels does not seem to have gone in search of his intellectual equal. Others see Mary Burns as vastly more important. I wanted to see you in your own homes, Engels wrote in dedicating his first book to the working classes of Great Britain. To observe you in everyday life, to chat with you on your conditions and grievances, to witness your struggles. He never could have achieved this ambition without a guide, certainly not in the short span of his first sojourn in England. And achieving it marked him for life. 20 months in Manchester and London, W.O. Henderson observes, for which read 10 to 15 months with Mary Burns, had turned Engels from an inexperienced youth into a young man who had found a purpose in life. Terrell Carver writes in his biography of Engels, just simply entitled Engels, here, let's see, about his personal life. So here it is on page 72. I have said little about Engels' personal life since I think that most of it was irrelevant to a brief consideration of his ideas. It is true that he successively kept the working-class Burns sisters, Mary and Lizzie, as his mistresses in accommodation in Manchester, separate from his own lodgings as a middle-class bachelor. And it is true that he rode to hounds, had a taste for champagne and claret, and maintained himself in fashionable neighborhoods and spas. Some commentators have implied that there was an incongruity between his lifestyle and his political position as a revolutionary communist. But had Engels been respectively married, taken little exercise, lived in poverty or with very modest means, eschewed paid employment, and resided in lower middle-class surroundings, I doubt whether he would have escaped this particular censure any more than Marx, whose circumstances I've just described. Had Engels and Marx lived impeccably proletarian lives, they would probably have had no time for their intellectual labors, and in any case, subsequent critics might have attacked them for belying their own middle-class origins and becoming phonies. The lifestyle of any radical critic of contemporary social arrangements is bound to look incongruous. So on the one hand, Engels did eschew marriage and sort of took a libertine attitude towards women's sexuality and relationships, especially during the Mary Burns period, which, Mary Burns was quite radical. But then he did marry her sister, Lizzie, after she died. So, whether that was sort of a demand of hers for him to continue keeping house, or having her keep house, I don't know. But, in some senses, sort of this free love attitude was a little bit considered bourgeois in the sort of struggle between Marx and Engels over his relationships. Now, that said, there is a criticism of Engels that he sort of called. He talked about Karl Ulrich's book to Marx. Karl Ulrich was an early sort of advocate of the rights of gay folks in the 19th century. Engels read his book Incubus, and so we'll talk about a little bit later why his critique of Incubus is not as homophobic as it may sound. But first, we'll get into talking about the public universal friend. So before we get into the weeds, talking about the public universal friend, I just want to talk real quickly about transgender history in the United States, in the early United States. So we'll go back to the 17th century here, and I'm just going to read from the Wikipedia entry on transgender history of transgender people in the United States. So Thomas or Thomasine Hall, an indentured servant in Virginia, reported being both a man and a woman, and adopted clothes and roles of each at different times until ordered by court in 1629 to wear both men's breeches and a woman's apron. Hall is thought to have been intersex and is cited as an early example of a gender nonconforming individual in colonial America. In 1776, the public universal friend reported being genderless, dressed androgynously, and as followers gained while preaching throughout New England over the next 4 decades not to use their birth name or gendered pronouns. Some scholars have called the friend a chapter in trans history before the word transgender. There were also cases of people living as the opposite gender in the early republic, such as Joseph Lobdell, who was assigned female at birth in 1829, lived as a man for 60 years, and married a woman. Charlie Pankhurst was a stagecoach driver who was assigned female at birth but lived his professional life as a man. During the Civil War, over 200 people who had been assigned female at birth donned men's clothing and fought as soldiers. Some lived the rest of their lives as men and are thought by some to have been transgender, such as Albert Cashier. After the war, Frances Thompson, a formerly enslaved black trans woman, testified before Congress's investigation of the Memphis riots of 1866. 10 years later, she was arrested for being a man dressed in women's clothing. In the late 1800s, Wiwa Zuni Imana, fiber artist and potter, became a prominent cultural ambassador, visiting Washington, D.C. in 1896 and meeting President Grover Cleveland. The Ihamana are male-bodied people who may at times take on the social and ceremonial roles usually performed by women in their culture, and at other times the roles more traditionally associated with men. In 1895, a group of self-described androgynes in New York organized a club called the Circle Hermaphroditos to unite for defense against the world's bitter persecution. They included Jenny June, assigned male at birth in 1874, whose The Autobiography of an Androgyne, 1918, was one of the few first-person accounts in the early years of the 20th century, which cast light on what life for a transgender person was like then. So we see that there was sort of a basis for transgender rights during this time. So I'd like to just read from Dr. Moyer's book about the Revolutionary Era, and then, we'll get into a little bit later about the Second Great Awakening and sort of the gender changes that brought about. I think a lot of times people think of Christianity as having really a reactionary approach towards gender, but it was really the Christian radicals throughout American history that have sort of pushed the boundaries of gender conformity. So here's a section from Dr. Moyer's book, The Public Universal Friend, where he talks about the revolutionary era, which came before, in the 1770s. The Second Great Awakening was teens and 20s. But the social changes and gender changes that resulted from that. So it says, the Revolutionary Era was a time when prophets walked the land, people exercised miraculous spiritual gift, and sectarian groups espousing fantastic creeds drew in eager converts. Anne Lee of the Shakers, Shadrach Ireland of the Harvard, Massachusetts Perfectionists, Benjamin Randall, the Free Will Baptists, and Caleb Bridge of the Universalists were but a few of the men and women who styled themselves holy visionaries and created religious movements. The revolution proved fertile ground for the growth of new religious sects because of its unprecedented upheavals, opened the doors to extraordinary levels of spiritual ferment and social change. America sundered its ties with the British Empire, which not only upset long-standing structures of political authority, but also ultimately called into question all sorts of traditional power relationships, including those that had ranked people according to categories of class, sex, and race. America's war for independence added another dimension of instability as people dealt with death, destruction, and the fear of defeat, as well as economic hardship brought on by disruptions in trade and rampant inflation. In short, the revolution cut America loose from many of the moorings that had traditionally held it in place and initiated a contentious process through which its people cobbled together a new social order. The revolution acted as a pivot that swung America away from a religious culture dominated by an educated clergy who emphasized a sacerdotal and sacramental path to salvation, and towards a new one characterized by popular belief, charismatic leadership, and the idea of universal salvation to all who accepted Jesus as their Savior. The independence movement also democratized American Christianity, and that the colonies' break from Britain helped to undermine state-sponsored denominations and open the door to increased religious pluralism and choice. Baptist, Methodist, and other insurgent denominations grew in strength over the course of the era and dominated America's religious landscape by the early 19th century. Besides providing new churches to choose from, the revolution promoted a new religious climate. Its democratic overtones nurtured a brand of Christianity where lay control and popular forms of religious expression held in sway. In addition, new and liberating religious concepts that emphasized human free will and challenged the pessimism and hierarchical tendencies of Calvinist theology arose during the Revolutionary Era. Religion, in turn, enhanced the revolution's radical potential and fueled its more democratic leanings. The linking of American independence to long-standing millennial expectations helped to transform colonial opposition from a mere rebellion against British authority to a truly revolutionary re-envisioning of American society. Besides propelling the bid for home rule, religion also helped to radicalize an internal struggle over who would rule at home, and spiritual seekers like North Carolina's Herman Husband and Maine's Nathan Barlow infused their resistance to government officials and powerful elites with religious meaning. The Universal Friends ministry parallels these broader trends of religious change and revitalization. Jemima Wilkinson, like many of the holy visionaries of the Revolutionary Era, had no formal theological training, and her story illuminates a process by which lay people overturned the authority of the clergy and not only took charge of their religious lives, but created new religions. Okay, so the Friend, had a message of universal salvation. Also, we'll visit the house. Hopefully, we'll get a chance later in the episode for our On Location section to visit the Jemima Wilkinson or Universal Friend house, where they all live together communally. And Wilkinson did express that celibacy was really the goal, but she did allow, they did allow marriage. Dr. Moore goes on here, recounting the Public Universal Friend's prophetic career also sheds light on the complex cross-currents that shaped the lives of men and women during the Revolutionary era. America's independence movement set in motion changes that reconfigured constructs of manhood and womanhood by the early 19th century. Nevertheless, efforts to alter standing gender arrangements, especially with regard to women, were not quick and easy, but contested and halting. During the imperial crisis of the 1760s and 70s, women experienced an unprecedented level of political activity in the public sphere as they signed petitions, created their own patriotic organizations, and took an active role in non-importation campaigns against Britain. In addition, the stress of war propelled some women far beyond their accepted role. There are a number of examples of revolutionary Mali pictures, women who became impromptu soldiers on the battlefield, and other women like Deborah Sampson who disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the military. There were institutional gains for women during this time. However, women became not full partners in the Republic, as Dr. Moyer goes on here, but Republican mothers who were not to wield power in the public sphere, but remain at home laboring to raise the next generation of virtuous male citizens. The new construct of womanhood certainly boosted the public perception of women and opened up new avenues for their education. However, it fell short of offering them real political equality in terms of suffrage or property rights. This pattern of conservatism and change with regard to gender roles extended to religious life, throwing into sharp relief the transformation of American Christianity during the Revolutionary era did not end female subordination. The First Great Awakening witnessed a number of developments related to growth of female authority and more positive evaluation of female identity. In contrast to the Great Awakening's challenge to gender conventions, the era of the American Revolution often appears as a more reactionary period that undermined the gains in religious authority women experienced in mid-century. So there's also an argument against that. So Moyer argues, presenting an analysis that includes both the Public Universal Friend and the Prophet's followers, and that examines religious doctrine as well as practice, best illustrates the dialogue between religion and gender in revolutionary America. So we've talked a bit about, Wilkinson and her transformation into this genderless being, a public universal friend. You've noticed that I've slipped up on the pronouns a little bit, perhaps. But I think Dr. Moyer makes a good argument for his use of both female, male, and non-gender pronouns in this. So here's what he says about that in the introduction. From a perspective that privileges biological distinctions over sex over the more flexible construct of gender, Jemima Wilkinson was one of the few women in American history to found a religious sect and the first native-born American woman to do so. For her part, Wilkinson would have disagreed with this assessment, for she did not see herself as a woman after her rebirth as the Friend, but as a heaven-sent spirit of truth. Either view points to the dramatic transformation of America's religious landscape and gender instability that characterized the Revolution. Not only did Wilkinson test the boundaries of religious orthodoxy by taking on the mantle of a prophet and creating a new faith, but the Universal Friend's holy persona blurred the very distinction between male and female. The story of Jemima Wilkinson's rise to prophethood presents problems to anyone who wishes to tell it, for it involves two beings. One, an extraordinary young woman, the other, a masculine spirit of God, who inhabited a single female body. The first challenge is to figure out how to characterize the gender identities of Wilkinson and the Universal Friend. When it comes to the former, this task is relatively straightforward. The historical record concerning Wilkinson's early life is admittedly scant, but there's no hint that she possessed some sort of transgendered identity or even thought of herself as anything but a woman before she became the Friend. Thus, it appears that whatever change Wilkinson experienced upon her rebirth as a heavenly prophet was driven by spiritual factors rather than some long-term struggle over her gender identity. Deciphering the Universal Friend's gender persona is far more difficult. Neither the prophet nor any members of the Society of Universal Friends ever reflected on this point, but they did leave clues in their behavior. The prophet's dress, speech, and demeanor, as well as some of the practices of the sect, make it clear that they did not envision the Friend as female. Though the prophet's appearance and actions were laden with masculine elements, the Friend was not simply a male figure, but a being with an indeterminate gender that defies easy attempts at classification. As one contemporary observer put it, the Universal Friend was not to be supposed of either sect and acted in ways that reinforced the image of being neither man nor woman. Indeed, this ambiguity was not incidental to the prophet's self-presentation, but was an essential part of the Friend's efforts to appear as an otherworldly visitor. In the final calculation, nailing down the exact nature of the public Universal Friend's gender identity is not essential, for the key to unlocking the meaning of the Friend's ministry does not lie in divining the prophet's sense of self, but understanding how others interpreted and acted on the heavenly messenger's creed. The second challenge in recounting the tale of the Universal Friend is a matter of language. More specifically, the problem emerges whether to use the female pronouns, feminine pronouns, she and her, or the masculine ones, he and him, when discussing the prophet. Using the feminine forms implicitly denies a belief devoutly held by the Society of Universal Friends and their leader, that Jemima Wilkinson had been transformed into a heaven-sent masculine spirit. Put another way, such an authorial decision would implicitly give the impression that Wilkinson was a fake. Instead, this study generally follows the lead of the Friend's disciples, who consistently use the male pronouns he and him in reference to their spiritual guide. The only exception to this is in passages that deal with contemporary commentators who denied the legitimacy of Wilkinson's claims and continue to view her as a designing or deluded woman. In such instances, she and her come back into use. This switching back and forth between the Friend as a he and a she is a bit awkward at times, but it certainly captures the difficulties of coming to terms with a gender-ambiguous prophet. This account addresses many aspects of Jemima Wilkinson's prophetic career, yet why she underwent her transformation into holy messenger is not among them. All right. So that's where, he kind of justifies his use of both, feminine and masculine pronouns when talking about Jemima Wilkinson and then ultimately the Universal Friend. So that'll conclude our discussion, I think, for now of the public Universal Friend. Like I said, hopefully we can get down to Penn to visit the house a little bit later, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about their communal
Joseph
arrangements
received
there.
many important revelations from God, most of which are compiled in a book entitled The Doctrine and Covenants, which the Church accepts as Scripture. One of these revelations, received by Joseph in December of 1830, commanded that the Church move to Ohio. Accordingly, in January of 1831, the prophet, along with his wife and several other church members, boarded a horse-drawn sleigh and set out for Kirtland, where Mormon missionaries had reported great success in previous months. Their first stop upon arriving in Kirtland was the Newell K. Whitney store. Joseph entered and extended his hand to the man behind the counter.
Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man.
Somewhat bewildered, the merchant replied,
You have the advantage of me, sir. I could not call you by name as you have me.
I am Joseph, the prophet. You prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?
It is said that the prophet, while in the East, had seen the Whitneys in vision, praying for his coming to Kirtland. Soon after Joseph's arrival, Kirtland was designated as the official gathering place for members of the church. As converts began pouring in, this small town became the hub of church activity and would remain so for 7 years, from 1831 to 1838. During this time, the saints built many homes and settled large portions of land. They erected stores, mills, an ashery, a tannery, and a school, as well as an inn for travelers. Many of these buildings can still be seen today. For a time, Joseph and his family lived in the John Johnson home in Hiram, a community 30 miles southeast of Kirtland. Then, in 1832, Newell K. Whitney offered part of his store as a home for Joseph and his wife Emma. Gratefully, Joseph accepted, and a carpenter was employed to remodel the upstairs into a residence, office, and meeting room. The meeting room was used for the School of the Prophets, where classes were held in theology and English grammar. Eventually, the curriculum included political science, literature, geography, ancient languages, and the sciences. It was also in the Whitney store that the church's extensive welfare system had its beginnings. After being called as one of the first bishops in the church, Newell K. Whitney consecrated his store to the service of the church, and it became a distribution center of goods to the poor. Today, hundreds of modern warehouses have replaced Bishop Whitney's building, but the principle remains the same. The funds and labor for the welfare system are all donated by church members out of a concern for the poor and needy. The Lord commanded the church to build a house of God, a temple in Kirtland. In this temple, the Lord said he would endow the members of his church with power from on high. For the young, struggling church, it was an overwhelming assignment. Most of its members were in the depths of poverty. But Joseph had a motto: when the Lord commands, do it. And so they did. This was to be no ordinary building, but a temple built of quarried stone with an interior of finely crafted wood. Timber was cut and milled. Iron was forged. The carpet and drapery were made by the women. Stone was cut and hauled from nearby quarries, where the actual drill marks made nearly a century and a half ago can still be seen at one of these sites just south of the village.
So that was a video from the official LDS church. It's a vintage one from, I think, the 70s or 80s. But, you know, what it conveniently leaves out of the story of the settlement of Kirtland, Ohio, is Mormon communalism, right? And it was really based on this idea of the United Order. The United Order was, here's what it says on Wikipedia. The Latter-day Saint movement, the United Order, also called the United Order of Enoch, was one of several 19th century church collectivist programs. Early versions of the United Order began in 1831, attempting to fully implement the law of consecration, a form of Christian communism or communalism, modeled after the New Testament church, which had all things in common. We've talked about that before, the verse in Acts that talks about how all who believed lived together and had everything in common, from each according to ability to each according to need. But really this idea of the United Order sort of originated with Sidney Rigdon, and Rigdon became a revelator. He started seeing visions early on, and reportedly saw visions jointly with Smith. According to one account, Joseph would at intervals say, "What do I see?" as one might say while looking out the window and beholding what all in the room could not see. Then he would relate what he had seen or what he was looking at. Then Sidney replied, "I see the same." So essentially, one of Rigdon's followers had gone to meet Joseph Smith in New York, and Smith decided to come west to Ohio as a result of sort of Rigdon's teaching there. But prior to Joseph Smith's arrival in Kirtland, Ohio, Rigdon had been preaching among a group called the Morley family, and Isaac Morley was one of Rigdon's followers, and he had formed this utopian community on his land. So he started this communal situation, Isaac Morley, and so then essentially Joseph Smith came to Kirtland and took over the Morley family and the Rigdonites and I'll talk about pretty soon what ended up happening to Rigdon. But the United Order came as a revelation from Joseph Smith in 1831, and they began forming United Orders in the 1830s. According to this revelation, Joseph Smith had said that God wanted them to follow the law of consecration, which would form United Order, where property was deeded to the church, and then the church distributes everything, from each according to ability, to each according to need. Some of the land would be deeded back, and so the church at times would sort of use a hybrid form of communism and capitalism. Also, at times the church would own the land, but they would recognize, the families as the stewards of the land. When Joseph Smith received this revelation in 1831, it was meant to be a lasting order until the Second Coming. And, but the problem was, with a lot of these early American socialist experiments, they ended up collapsing due to economic reasons and different things. By 1833, the original Joseph Smith United Orders had collapsed, and they transitioned back to a form of private ownership. So let's get back to Rigdon. So essentially, God revealed to Smith that he should take charge of the Morley family. Rigdon had been tarred and feathered with Joseph Smith, in 1832 in Hiram, Ohio. Smith recorded, the next morning I went to see Elder Rigdon and found him crazy and his head highly inflamed, for they had dragged him by his heels, and those two so high from the earth he could not raise his head from the rough frozen surface that lacerated it exceedingly. And when he saw me, he called his wife to bring him his razor. She asked him what he wanted of it, and he replied, to kill me. Sister Rigdon left the room, and he asked me to bring his razor. I asked him what he wanted of it, and he replied he wanted to kill his wife. And he continued some delirious days. So apparently after this incident, he was really sort of delirious, became depressed, so essentially, Joseph Smith took over Rigdon's movement. Now, later on, Rigdon would be kicked out of the LDS and form the Rigdonite movement, actually, which was a rival movement to the LDS. That was not the end of the United Order, though, in 1833. So when Brigham Young took over the community, the LDS leadership in the 1850s, they moved to, that was, so when they were, after they had been kicked out of Nauvoo, Illinois, again, kicked out of Kirtland, kicked out of Nauvoo, and then they went west to Utah, like we saw at the beginning of our episode here. And Brigham Young, so Joseph Smith died and Brigham Young took over control of the LDS, and they formed several United Orders in Utah. The first one was called Orderville, and unfortunately it collapsed pretty soon after it was founded. The other one was Kanab, United Order of Kanab, in 1874, and that one actually was quite prosperous, and it actually, their communal system really kind of worked out for them. It says from the Wikipedia, by 1874 there were 81 families, and about 17% of the men that lived in this community practiced polygamy. So that's what we're going to get to in a second. Of course, obviously that's a reason that they were kicked out of, New York, Kirtland, and then Nauvoo. Kanab became pretty popular, and so people, a lot of people ended up moving in, and it sort of put a strain on their communal system. By 1880, the United Order of Canab had the population had really decreased, and essentially the United Order collapsed. Today, some Mormon offshoots, some sects do use the United Order still, including the Apostolic United Brethren, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which we'll talk about in a minute, FLDS. Also liberal Mormon groups like the United Order Family of Christ and the Cutlerite sect, the Church of Jesus Christ. Also, I should mention the Community of Christ, also known as the Reformed LDS or RLDS. They actually have control over the temple in Kirtland now, and they actually do lean into the communal system of the United Order, unlike the Mormons of today. Now, the FLDS in Utah, in Short Creek, Utah, also known as Little Dale, they had a United Order system, and of course their leader, Warren Jeffs, if you don't know, several years ago went to prison for child abuse, pedophilia, right? And of course they're also polygamists. They still practice polygamy too, so which is illegal according to Utah and federal law. But the state, as a result of Warren Jeffs' prosecution, broke up the FLDS. So actually they had to break up the United Order as well. And so one of the members was tasked with distributing the remaining church's holdings, to private individuals, and there was actually a lot of controversy over that, and accusations of fraud and things. Like I said, today, modern day practicing LDS members distance themselves from communism, but, it's undeniable the law of consecration and the United Order is still in their holy book. So, there still are the seeds, even though the LDS is really quite a conservative movement today, there still are these radical elements within Mormon teaching. So before we move on to talking about polygamy, I do want to talk a little bit more about the United Order and the law of consecration. This is from a chapter by Matthew J. Groh and Bradley Keim called Mormon Communalism and Millennialism in Transatlantic Context. And this is from the book Protestant Communalism and the Transatlantic World, 1650 to 1850, edited by Philip Lockley. It's an anthology, but they have a section here, Mormon Communalism in Review, and I'll just read from this really briefly. Latter-day Saint communal efforts drew not only on New Testament precedents, like most other religiously inspired communalisms in the transatlantic world, but also on their own scriptures. Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, which he stated that he translated from records left by inhabitants of ancient America in March 1830, the month before he founded his church. It denounces selfishness and individualism, and expressed a vision of godly society in which people had all things in common among them, and thus there were not rich or poor, bond and free, but they were all made free as partakers in the heavenly gift. In the early 1830s, Smith reported frequently receiving divine revelations, many of which mandated that God's saints be unified socially, religiously, and economically. If ye are not equal in earthly things, one revelation declared, ye cannot be equal in obtaining heavenly things. Another revelation expanded upon the biblical narrative of the prophet Enoch to describe how Enoch's people built a city that was called the City of Holiness, even Zion. The inhabitants of Zion, rather like early Christians in the New Testament book of Acts, were of one heart and one mind, and dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. Smith's visions proved persuasive to many of his contemporaries who, like him, had suffered from the economic instability brought on by antebellum America's accelerating participation in a market economy and from the religious confusion of the Second Great Awakening, which I've talked about quite a bit before. The creation of an ideal society, which Mormons named Zion, and the city built by Enoch promised to rescue converts from the rampant individualism of Jacksonian America. Like other communal groups, 19th century Mormons not only challenged ideas of individualism and private property, but also traditional notions of family, not with celibacy like the Shakers or Harmonists, but by embracing plural marriage beginning in the early 1840s. Harmonists were not exactly celibate, though. So that's it. Okay. While communalism runs deeply through Mormon history, Mormons made two specific large-scale attempts at communal economics during the 19th century. In the early 1830s in Missouri, Mormons initially practiced what they called the law of consecration and stewardship. Mormons would deed all of their property to the church and would then receive management back of specific properties proportionate to their particular needs. This attempt at communal living suffered from internal discord and external pressure, as local settlers forced the Mormons on 3 separate occasions to abandon their Missouri settlements in the 1830s. The memory of this attempt to establish Zion left an indelible impression on 19th century Latter-day Saints, including Smith's successor Brigham Young, who led most Mormons to Utah. In Utah, Mormons engaged in a variety of cooperative economic projects under Young's direction, including the establishment of a cooperative economic system in Brigham City in 1864 and the founding of Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution in Salt Lake City in 1868. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, partly as a result of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which threatened to end Utah's isolation, Young encouraged the establishment of communal societies, known collectively as United Order of Enoch in many Mormon communities. The United Orders were generally producer cooperatives in which local saints, after pooling their property and labor, received profits and income in proportion to what they had contributed. In a few communities, more concerted United Orders prevailed, in which the saints donated all their resources aimed for self-sufficiency and shared equally in the products of their labor. So there's essentially the United Order in a nutshell. Now, on the issue of polygamy, so on July 12, 1843, Smith received a revelation from God. The revelation allowed Smith and other male church leaders to have more than one wife. Historian Van Wagner claims that Smith developed an interest in polygamy after studying parts of the Old Testament in which prophets had more than one wife. However, it's difficult to know when Smith decided to begin teaching or practicing polygamy. Many early converts to the religion, including Brigham Young, Orson Pratt, and Lyman Johnson, recorded that Joseph Smith was teaching polygamy privately as early as 1831 or 1832. Pratt recorded that Smith told some early members in 1831 and 1832 that polygamy was a true principle, but that the time to practice it had not yet come. At the time, the practice was kept secret from non-members and most church members. Throughout his life, Smith publicly denied having multiple wives. During this time, the church publicly disavowed polygamy, and some church members knew about the teachings and practiced polygamy. Joseph Smith publicly condemned and denied his involvement in polygamy, and participants were excommunicated for practicing polygamy without instruction and consent from leaders of the church. However, church members who received permission began practicing polygamy in the 1840s. The number of members aware of polygamy grew until the church started openly practicing polygamy in early 1852, 8 years after Smith's death. According to some historians and then contemporary accounts, by this time polygamy was openly taught and practiced. The doctrine authorizing polygamy was canonized and first published in 1876 version of the church's Doctrine and Covenants. Now, polygamy, as opposed to polygyny or polyamory, is when a man can have multiple wives. Polygyny is when a woman has multiple husbands, and polyamory is just sort of a general group marriage, sort of like the complex marriage that they had in the Oneida community, which we'll talk about. There were two types of LDS polygamous marriages, eternity only and time and eternity. Eternity only polygamous marriages applied only in the afterlife, and time and eternity marriages applied both in mortal life and in the afterlife. Most likely Joseph Smith did not have sexual relations with all of his wives, as some were only eternity only marriages. So this teaching really got them into a lot of trouble. For over 60 years, the LDS Church in the United States were at odds over the issue. The Church defended its practice as a matter of religious freedom, while the federal government aggressively sought to eradicate it, consistent with prevailing public opinion. Polygamy was probably a significant factor in the Utah War of 1857 and 1858, given Republican attempts to paint Democratic President James Buchanan as weak in his opposition to both polygamy and slavery. In 1862, the United States Congress passed the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, which prohibited polygamy marriage in the territories. In spite of the law, Latter-day Saints continue to practice polygamy, believing that it was protected by the First Amendment. In 1879, in Reynolds v. United States, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the Morrill Act, stating, "Laws are made for government of actions, while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinion, they may with practices." In 1890, when it became clear that Utah was not to be admitted to the Union while polygamy was still practiced, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto that officially terminated the practice of polygamy. Although this manifesto did not absolve existing polygamous marriages, relations in the United States markedly improved after 1890, such that Utah was admitted as a state in 1896. After the manifesto, some church members continued to enter into polygamous marriages, but these eventually stopped in 1904 when Church President Joseph F. Smith disavowed polygamy before Congress and issued a second manifesto calling for all polygamous marriages in the church to cease and establish excommunication as the consequence for those who disobeyed. So that's essentially, so that's basically what led to a split with the Apostolic United Brethren and the Fundamentalist Church, FLDS. That's essentially the history of their polygamous teaching. Now, like I said, polygamy is when a man can have multiple wives. We'll talk next about the Oneida community, who had a group marriage situation, complex marriage, which we sort of heard John Noyes' biblical defense of that at the beginning. So we'll talk about that next. So now we get to our final topic, which is the Oneida community's system of complex marriage. We've obviously talked about the Oneida community in this show before, especially in the first season. We did a whole episode on the Oneida community, but now we're going to talk specifically about their complex marriage system. I'm going to read from this book here by Maureen Lockwood Carden, Oneida Community to Utopian Community to Modern Corporation. So here she talks about the beginning of the complex marriage system. Until the breakup of the Putney community in 1847, only those closest to Noyes knew that his concept of a perfect society included the practice of complex marriage. But in the mid-1840s, those few waited expectantly for him to declare them ready to overstep the bounds of matrimony and have sexual relations with the husbands and wives of other members. Several men and women were tempted to be unfaithful to their spouses. At least one man and woman were known to have been so. However, when these cases were brought to Noyes' attention, he strictly forbade any sexual intimacy outside marriage on the grounds that the sense of sin felt by those concerned showed that they were still unconvinced that such a step was God's will. Noyes himself had to start the new marriage system. In May 1846, he found himself attracted to a member of the community, Mary E. Cragen. She returned his feelings. At the same time, Mrs. Cragen's husband, George, and Noyes' wife admitted their growing affection for each other. After a careful discussion, the four agreed they shared the conviction that it was God's will for them to exchange sexual partners, and they did so. Two more couples soon joined them in the practice of complex marriage. Toward the end of 1846, Noyes and his wife George Cregan and his wife, Noyes' sisters Charlotte and Harriet, and their husbands John R. Miller and John L. Skinner, stated the principles of their social union. They agreed to an absolute community of property, including people as well as material possessions. Further, they recognized the ultimate authority of God in all things, and they submitted to the will of John Humphrey Noyes as the father and overseer whom the Holy Ghost has set over the family thus constituted. So there you have the origins of complex marriage. Essentially, Noyes was attracted to his follower's wife and decided to institute it, although he was hesitant at first to initiate the practice, although he did preach that it was a constituent of the perfect society, right? Now, ultimately, complex marriage was sort of the undoing of the community, and I'll read now from the same book in a later section where the chapter about the breakup. So, in the last years of the 1870s, the community was for the first time vulnerable to internal dissension. When the leaders failed to promote perfectionist theology, they had undermined the members' faith in the divine justification for Oneida's way of life. When they failed to implement the original perfectionist ideas, they had deprived members of common principles on the basis of which to resolve disagreements. The only consistent reinterpretation of the ideas, that giving greater emphasis to personal sacrifice for the community, had upset the balance that Noyes had achieved earlier in satisfying individual and group interests. Noyes himself was no longer seen as Christ's representative, but as the person who exercises more influence in the affairs of the community than anyone else, because his head is wisest and his heart largest and truest. Unguided and uncertain, the community members continued their daily lives, outwardly calm but inwardly anxious. The point of contention which brought into being two opposing parties was the question of the initiation of virgins into the sexual realities of community life. The initiation of young men posed no problem. Sexual relations began routinely for them at puberty. The difficulty arose rather in connection with the younger girls. By common consent, Noyes had always assumed the responsibility for introducing them to sexual experience. His attraction to them was real, and he developed a strong romantic attachment to each one. His own rule forbade exclusive love, preventing the relationship from lasting very long, and preserved him from the disillusion of fading romances. The women, however, continued to love him for years. Noyes established such strong and lasting emotional bonds that during the breakup, with scarcely any exception, he retained the respect and love of all the young women, as well as the older women who had come to the community years earlier. As he grew older, Noyes sometimes delegated the role of first husband to one of the several central men. Early in 1879, two of them questioned Noyes' right to decide who was to introduce young women of the community to sexual experience. Of these men, William A. Hines had been at Oneida since its founding. The other, James W. Towner, had joined in 1874. It is probable that their outspoken protest was precipitated by some personal disappointment over the selection of first husbands. In any event, approximately 30 men and women joined them to form a highly aggressive party protesting Noyes' authority. The schism between the Townerites and the Noyesites was not one of the youngest against old, oppressed members against central figures, or religious against non-religious members. Within each of these groups, there were those who supported the Townites and those who supported the Noyesites. The Towner party held one powerful weapon. Not only did Noyes generally act as the first husband, he also assumed this responsibility when some of the girls were very young. Documentary evidence for this fact is to be found in Eli van der Walker's gynecological study published in 1884. In the 1870s, Theodore Noyes told Dr. van der Walker that there were some fears that in the community that the peculiar sexual practices of the members might have a bad effect on the health of the women. Since there is no indication that any member had reason to fear ill health, and since the medical ramifications of complex marriage had not concerned members for 30 years, their fears seemed suspect. Perhaps behind them lay unexpressed objections to the management of the system. In any case, in 1877, Dr. van der Warker was invited to examine the women. Within the limitations of medical science in the 1870s, and in spite of his expressed objection to complex marriage, he was unable to find any significant differences in the health of the women examined at Oneida and that of those he encountered in his regular practice. His tabulation of personal data for 42 women do reveal to us, however, that the 23 who had begun menstruation at the community had been introduced to complex marriage very soon after the onset of menstruation. The ages ranged from 10 to 18 years. The average was just over 13. Dr. van der Warker wrote that when he had examined 31 bright and intelligent women, modest and ladylike in manner, and had collected personal data about 11 more, John Humphrey Noyes sent an order to discontinue the proceedings. Thus, van der Warker's support refers only to a non-random sample of about 1/3 of community women who were between ages of 15 and 80. Limited though it was, the investigation provides us with evidence of the serious threat that the Towner faction could use against Noyes. If they wished, one or more of their members who had an underage daughter could bring legal action against them and any other central members who had acted as the first husband, accusing them of statutory rape. Obviously, the member of the Noyes party could bring similar suits against men in the Towner party who, although they had not initiated any of the virgins, had had sexual relations with young women below the age of consent. If any legal action or actions were begun, however, Noyes, as originator of complex marriage and as the traditional first husband, would be the man upon whom the outside world would focus its condemnation. Bitter arguments arose as the community took sides on the question of who should authorize a girl's introduction to complex marriage and who in the community should provide that introduction. The Townerites charged Noyes and his loyal lieutenants with despotism. They received the old reply in defense. Noyes' autocratic rule was justified as the revelation of God's will. But people on both sides had begun to question Noyes' divine mission, and few thought that he was making clear enough the principles for which he and supposedly they stood. Dissent focused on Noyes and on the subject of virginity, but it really extended to the whole matter in which the community was governed. New troubles were heaped upon the wrangling community. A group of clergymen, led by Professor John W. Mears of nearby Hamilton College, threatened an attack upon the immoral perfectionists. The community had long been accustomed to countering such attacks, but now it could scarcely put up united opposition. On June 22, 1879, Myram Kinsley, one of the men faithful to Noyes, discussed with him the fear, which may or may not have had substance, that hostile community members or Mears's group, acting alone or in collaboration, might bring criminal action against them. Two men decided that Noyes should leave immediately. Stealthily in the night, his plan known to only one or two persons, he fled some 200 miles to the international frontier and the safety of Canada. Okay, so now we have come to the part where we have to talk about our uncomfortable conclusion to this episode. So, the end of the Oneida community was when John Humphrey Noyes ran away to Canada in 1880. And one of the reasons that he ran away to Canada was that the Mormons had been driven out of New York State. Joseph Smith had multiple underage wives, what we would consider underage today. Here's what an LDS website, fairlatterdaysaints.org, has to say about the question: was Joseph Smith a serial practitioner of statutory rape? Charges of statutory rape are inapplicable since no such law or convention applied to any of Joseph's wives. Joseph's percentage of wives in their teen years was less than the series percentage of wives in Kirkland, Nauvoo, or the 1850 U.S. Census, even among men his own age. If anything, Joseph married a greater percentage of older women, which suggests that motives other than sexual attraction drove these matches. Large spousal differences were not uncommon before and after Nauvoo among members and non-members. To attack Joseph Smith on the age of his wives is to misunderstand the historic time in which he lived. Modern readers have been unfairly treated by authors who, misled by or preying upon presentism, either did not know or declined to mention that the practice was routine in Joseph Smith's time. Christopher Hitchens, vocal atheist, savages Joseph as a serial practitioner of rape. So I don't know how I feel about this answer from the LDS Church. Plenty of reasons to criticize Christopher Hitchens. He's sort of a new atheist type that is still sort of very, very sort of bigoted at times in his analysis and not respectful of religious difference. But I gotta say, in this case, I really I don't know, because in Western New York, at least in 1880, that was one of the reasons that they drove Joseph Smith out. I'll read from this David White's article, John Humphrey Noyes, Philosopher, Bible, Communism, from Philosophy Now magazine. He says, one of the charges which eventually forced Noyes to flee to Canada was statutory rape. There's no doubt that Noyes had sex with girls who were legally underage, and that his defense would have never prevailed in court. But the clarity and cogency of his reasoning is philosophically interesting. Remember that sex in Oneida was a spiritual transaction, so it was necessary that young people be initiated by someone who was spiritually advanced. And almost always this meant chronologically older by more than a few years. Pairings had to be approved by a committee, but Noyes effectively reserved the virgin girls for himself and his cronies. So again, and he had this whole explanation. Noyes complained that limiting sex to conventional marriage arrangements made no provision for the sexual appetite at just the time it's strongest. He claimed that puberty commences at 14, but the average age of marriage was 24. He's making these arguments for why they needed to do this practice. I mean, the other thing was that older women would have sex with younger boys once they started going through puberty. So I think this is really exemplary of the limits of sexual radicalism. We want to make sure that even though you may critique elements of the traditional family, traditional relationships as oppressive or exploitative, sometimes you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, right? So maybe not everything needs to go totally the other way. And I think, I brought up the letter that Engels wrote to Marx regarding Karl Ulrich's work, Incubus. But I think it's important to put that in context, too, because we didn't talk about what is Incubus really about. So here, to answer that question, I'll read from the Joan of Arc blog by Keith Rosenthal, Monday, November 23rd, 2009, regarding the infamous letter that Engels sent Marx in 1869, which supposedly proved his homophobia. All right, so first of all, Engels is not commenting here on Karl Ulrich's overall theory of earning, his term for homosexuality, but rather on the specific pamphlet that Marx sent him titled Incubus. Ulrich had no such work, simply titled Earning. Engels must have been confused here. Indeed, it appears that Engels probably wasn't that familiar with any of Ulrich's work other than this one pamphlet. This is evidenced by the fact that in this and other letters, Engels and Marx seem to not even readily know the name of the author, let alone show a familiarity with his overall works. If one actually reads Incubus, it becomes quite clear why Engels may have reacted as viscerally as he does here. Further, it can be seen to be ridiculous to claim that Engels' comment on incubus somehow in themselves show that he is nothing but a hopeless bigot. Incubus is actually one of Ulrich's least flattering texts. It is a broad attempt at a psychosocial analysis of the causes that lead older men to commit rape and murder of younger children. The particular incident that spurs his writing is the case of Lieutenant von Zastrow, who had been charged with rape, physical mutilation, and murder of 2 boys in Berlin in 1867 and 69. Ulrich, who makes clear he is in no way defending acts of child rape and gruesome pederasty, nonetheless makes a plea for leniency for such criminals on the grounds that they are driven not by malice, but rather by faulty natural disposition or diseased nature, as he puts it alternatively. All in all, the work is very macabre, rather clumsy attempt to use his findings in his earlier studies of the Uranian gay male to prove that violent pederasts should not be treated as criminals, but rather spiritually ill people who cannot control the inborn nature of their sexual selves any more than a Uranian or straight Dionian for that matter. Sounds a little bit like Foucault. As Ulrich puts it, the Zastrow case stands in a close relationship to the sexual nature of the man loving earning. He goes on to explain, there is at times a yearning, wild, inordinate desire in certain individuals to commit cruelties and to see blood flow for no clear reason. A bloodthirstiness which, as it appears, goes far beyond a responsible state of mind, which at the moment in which it sets in seems to press heavily upon the soul of the individual as an incubus rising from the realm of darkness. In the course of Ulrich's analysis, he describes 15 cases of sexual perversion, in addition to the Zastrow case, many of which cases involve older men of high standing in German society. This is a very tough reading. To give you a flavor, and this is a warning, trigger warning here, to give you a flavor, Ulrich describes in gory detail how Zastrow first raped, castrated, and beat a 6-year-old boy to near death, and then later how he raped, beat, sodomized with a sharp stick, and then murdered a 15-year-old boy. The 15 other cases are of like brutality and graphic description. Indeed, Ulrich wants to highlight the utter brutality of these cases in order to prove his point that their pathological and therefore uncontrolled character is as great as the sexual brutality of the acts themselves. Therefore, he argues the courts ought not to punish these people, but rather seek other means of curbing this behavior. Now that we have a clear picture of the content of the specific work of Ulrich's that Marx had given Engels to read in 1869, and which Engels commented on in reply to Marx, we can understand why Engels would write that the work is a very curious thing involving extremely unnatural revelations. Again, Engels is not here commenting on homosexuality in general, or even the theory of earning itself, but rather the phenomenon of violent pederasty, pedophilia, which Ulrich himself calls unnatural, as detailed in Incubus. This also explains the comment Engels makes regarding his fear for the fate of the younger generation, a fate that does not await older individuals. It should now be clear that Engels is not just bringing the question of pederasty into his correspondence with Marx out of nowhere, owing purely to some supposed prejudiced notion that all homosexuals are pederasts, as has been intimated by some recent writers. He is in fact only talking about the issue at hand as raised by Ulrich in the pamphlet concerned. None of this is to deny that this particular private letter between Marx and Engels is written quite crassly and undoubtedly would have been formulated differently by Engels if it had been intended for public consumption. And his crude quip about front-side people with their childish penchants for females is itself plainly a childish and ridiculous comment. Moreover, Engels undoubtedly expresses an utter cluelessness about the nascent homosexuality identity just beginning to be articulated in Germany at the time. Though to be fair, homosexuality was talked about as a pathology by even its proponents until the rise of the German gay rights movement in the 1870s and 80s, well after Engels had penned the clumsy letter above. Indeed, the idea that there were even distinct homosexual and heterosexual types of people was not advanced until the 1870s by the German scientist and human rights campaigner Karl Maria Kirnt-Benny. It's also worth noting that the German Social Democratic Party, which Engels helped found and influenced until his death in 1895, would also, to its credit, become an early and dedicated supporter of the German gay rights movement upon its inception. In conclusion, I do think it's rather quite disingenuous to assert that this one letter in question proves the pervasive homophobia of Marx and Engels. Say what you will about Engels' response here to a muddled treatise analyzing the phenomenology of rape and violent pederasty in the male-loving Urning, but don't attempt to turn this letter into something it's not. That is, a conscious diatribe against homosexuality in general. And so, that brings me to my final point, which is that, like I mentioned earlier, just because we can identify and critique certain elements of the traditional family as oppressive and exploitative does not mean that we need to abolish the family altogether or to totally change sex and gender relations. But also we should be accepting of difference, right? But also make sure that acceptance of difference is not an acceptance then of other forms of exploitation. And I think, pedophilia is one obvious example. Another one is sex work, I think, too. Just because maybe there's been this sort of woke identity thing built around sex workers doesn't mean that we should support the sex industry. Right, because it is still an exploitative industry, right? So I'm going to finally talk about again, even amongst our heroes, sometimes we need to criticize, at times. Embarrassing takes that they might have. So, one of the people I would consider, a real pioneer of gay rights and of socialism in the 20th century United States was Harry Hay. And Harry Hay was a gay rights activist, communist, labor advocate, co-founder of the Matachin Society, the first sustained gay rights group in the United States, as well as the Radical Fairies, and he was a member of the Communist Party USA. And he did a lot, to support gay rights, although he did, criticize the mainstream gay rights movement. At times that criticism was apt, at other times not so much. When speaking at the 1983 Gay Academic Union Forum in New York University, his speech included, "If the parents and friends of gays are truly friends of gays, they would know from their gay kids that the relationship with an older man is precisely what 13, 14, and 15-year-old kids need more than anything else in the world." As well as highlighting his own relationship with an adult man when he was 14, saying, "I send to all of you my love and deep affection for what you offer to the boys in honor of this boy when he was 14 and when he needed to know best of all what only another gay man could show him and tell him." Yikes. He continued to speak on panels at NAMBLA events in 1984 and 1986. And at the 1986 Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade, he wore two signs. On his front, one that read, "Valerie Turinga walks with me," referring to a politician who agreed to withdraw from the event lest being jarred. And on his back, "NAMBLA walks with me," after organizers banned the pedophile advocacy group from joining the march. The organizers complained to police, and he narrowly avoided arrest. And Before Stonewall biographer Vern L. Bulla writes, "Getting him to agree to simply wear a sign supporting NAMBLA rather than carry a banner took considerable negotiation by the parade organizers, who wanted to distance the gay and lesbian movement from pedophilia, yet wanted Harry to participate." Into even into his very late life, in 1994, Hay refused to participate in the official parade in New York City commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots because it also refused NAMBLA a place in the event. Instead, he joined an alternate parade called the Spirit of Stonewall. In a 2002 article, The Real Harry Hay from the Phoenix, it says, "He was at times a serious political embarrassment, as when he consistently advocated the inclusion of the North American Man-Boy Love Association in gay pride parades." So, like I said, even some of our 20th century heroes. We still need to be critical. And we still need to, again, I really want to get this across, just because we identify oppressive elements in the traditional family structure does not mean that we have to throw out the family altogether, right? And you know, capitalism, it alienates us from the product of our labor. It alienates us from each other. It destroys communities. It tries to create a atomized, individualistic, alienated, you know, citizen of you know, that's totally disempowered in what's supposed to be a republic. And you know, and one of the factors in that process is an attack on the traditional family unit. And so the answer is not to then stop talking to your parents because they're bigots, or to you know, to eschew all people that disagree with you, right? We want to encourage community. We want to encourage togetherness. We want to encourage the communitarian spirit to come back, right? Because capitalism attacks it. It destroys it. And so all of that is to say, you know, no pedophilia, stop the sex industry, and call your parents, call your mother, call your father, go to Thanksgiving dinner, go to Christmas dinner, and don't sit there and be an asshole the whole time to your parents and talk about how everything that they believe is wrong. Because there are ways to talk to them about things without being a little pedantic, little jerk. All right, On Location's coming up next. Have American Socialism travels on location. Hello, welcome to our On Location segment of our show today. We are here at the Hill Cumorah. This is the location where Joseph Smith was given the tablets by the angel Moroni, which he was able to translate using the seer stones, and eventually translated into what became the Book of Mormon. So this is really one of the founding spots of the Church of Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and as well as the other Mormon traditions, which we talked about, Community of Christ and Fundamentalist LDS. So this is the path that Joseph Smith would have taken up the hill from the attendant at the Welcome Center told me from this side of the hill he would have gone up, and this is so we're here on the trail on the way up the hill, and you can really sort of put yourself in Joseph Smith's shoes. I mean, the beauty of the nature in this area, you know, it's early summer now, so we have a lot of vegetation. There's wild strawberries. There's mugwort growing everywhere, and you really do get the sense that it's a very sacred place. All right, so we're almost at the top of the hill now. You can see in the background the golden statue of the angel Moroni. Angel Moroni was of course, the angel that gave Joseph Smith the tablets, and most importantly, told Joseph Smith that none of the churches at the time were really fulfilling God's will, and that he should start his own church. And so that was really the birthplace of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right here. So this is one of the most sacred holy sites of the So after they left Western New York, the Latter-day Saints went to Kirtland, Ohio, where they joined the Wardley family, which was already practicing a communal system and a communal way of life. and Joseph Smith joined the movement there and sort of took it over. Now, there again was strife in Kirtland, and as you saw in the film clip at the beginning of the episode, they were forced then to move from Kirtland to Nauvoo, Illinois, and then once again Joseph Smith was killed in Nauvoo, and they were forced to move to Utah and began settling Utah under the leadership of Brigham Young. Okay, so we are here at the Public Universal Friend House. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, the Public Universal Friend is sort of considered today sort of a transgender or gender non-binary pioneer, right? Born Jemima Wilkinson, as it says on the sign, but known as the Universal Friend. Jemima Wilkinson was born a girl, of course, but eventually, just had a filling of the Holy Spirit, and became the Public Universal Friend, a genderless God or I guess spirit, prophet, maybe deity. They were sort of a Christian religion. They used the cross, of course, as a symbol. But, they were very radical at the same time. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the changes that were happening during the American Revolution were causing upheavals in the social condition, upheavals in gender roles for people. So, so this was really out of all of that sort of going on and then, of course, the First Great Awakening, which was before the American Revolution, started in Europe and was a revival of religion, and that really influenced a lot of movements. And so the First Great Awakening came through Western New York, and then, of course, the Second Great Awakening in the 18 teens and 20s was really when New York became known as the Burnt Over District. But the Public Universal Friend came before that, after the First Great Awakening, of course, and during the revolutionary period in American history. So I'm so glad to be out here at this beautiful pilgrimage site. And we're out here in Penn Yan, New York at the Public Universal Friend House. So the Public Universal Friend taught really that celibacy was the ideal, but they did allow marriages. Many of their followers either refer to them as a he or as, maybe gender neutral pronouns, they, them. But Jemima Wilkinson's detractors referred to her as a her. So that's, like we talked about earlier, part of Paul Moyer's discussion in his book is about sort of the difficulty in using pronouns when referring to the Public Universal Friend. But as I said, they did allow marriages, even though celibacy was really the ideal. Also, they lived communally, and in this house here, many of them did live and work and eat all together, as it says in the book of Acts, that the early Christians lived together and had all things. Thank you for joining me on this American Socialism Pioneers on Location Pride Month edition. I hope you have a good June and a good July. And remember Stonewall. Stonewall means fighting back, and Stonewall was a riot.
habitual the way we loved each other. Probably because our relationship wasn't based on bourgeois, fucked up values, attitudes,
Honey,
and goals.
you love me to think that I would ever have you for my God.
You do me wrong, but still I'm crazy about you.
How I love you.
Stay away too long and I can't do without you.
How I want you.
Every chance you get, you seem to hurt me more and more.
Silly of you to think that you could ever really want me to.
But each hurt makes my love stronger than before.
How I love you.
I know flowers grow from rain, but how can love grow from pain?
You're just a lover at the score.
Ain't that peculiar?
I know that I should be looking for more.
A peculiarity.
What could it be in you I see?
Ain't that peculiar, baby?
What could it be?
Peculiar as can be.
Oh love, stop making a fool of me.
Oh, you tell me lies that should be obvious to me.
Oh love, stop making a fool of me.
But I'm so much in love with you, baby, till I don't want to see that the things you do and say are designed to make me blue. It's a doggone shame my love for you makes all your lies seem true. If the truth makes love last longer, why do the lies make my love stronger?
Oh love, stop making a fool of me.
Ain't that peculiar, baby? Peculiar as can be. Ain't that peculiar? A peculiarity. Hey,
Oh love, stop making a fool of me.
hey, hey. Hey, hey.
Stop making a fool of me.
I've cried so much just like a child that's lost a toy. Maybe, baby, you think these tears I cry are tears of joy. A child can cry so much until you do everything they say. But unlike a child, my tears don't help me to get my way. I know love can last through years, but how can love last through tears? Ain't that peculiar, baby? Peculiarity. Ain't it peculiar, honey? Peculiar as can be. Say I don't understand it, baby. It's so strange sometimes. Ain't it peculiar?
What we decide to do with our lives.
you walking towards me right now? No audio.
Here's somebody walking.
Trail, the gravel trail, but you know where it is.
No, yeah, we came up.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you. Thank you.